Really appreciate everybody coming out. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Paul.
All right.
Thank you, Chris. The microphone's going to work. Thank you for coming out this evening. I heard the news on the way over, and I know you came to hear about politics, but I know you're really here. You want to know what happened with Tiger Woods and his wife. Okay, so, she's apparently gone to the police now, and she's admitted that she hit him with a golf club. And the police want to know how many times, and she said 6, but put me down for a 4. I wasn't sure if that would work or if I would need one of the pum-pum-pum, but anyway, my wife told me not to sing, and she actually told me not to try jokes either, but you know, you do what you can do. One of the things we wanted to talk about tonight was cap and trade and a little bit about the coal industry. What I tell people about it when I talk about this, and I'm dead serious about this, is that it's the same message here as it is in Bowling Green, as it is in Northern Kentucky, as it is in Western Kentucky. It isn't a message that comes to you just because we're in coal country. It's a message of private property. We address property in our country, and we address property rights in a way, and it's something that we should defend. And when we defend property rights in a rational manner, I think you allow things to occur that would be supportive of the coal industry. But it's not just because we support the coal industry, it's because we support the concept of private property. Now, a lot of the cap and trade issue has been moved forward by this whole idea of global warming. Well, some of you may have seen in the last week or so that they've now caught some of these guys lying. Now, we suspected it for a while, but they've now got emails showing that they have their conclusions before they get their facts. And if they don't like their facts, they cherry pick their facts. Some of the data, or most of the data on global warming is indirect data. There's temperature data, but only for very short periods of time. If you talk about geologic ages, like ice ages and warming ages, we're talking about tens of thousands of years. We have direct temperature data maybe for 50 to 100 years, and probably only really good data for probably 20 or 30 years, which means absolutely nothing. So most of the data on global warming is taken by inference. It's taken by the width of tree rings. But you know, there's a lot of things that goes into growing a tree. If you've ever grown a tree on your property, how much you water it, how much fertilizer you give it, and probably how much CO2 is in the air. They've drawn these conclusions mostly from people who want to limit the production of energy through fossil fuels. They've come to a conclusion in advance, and so then they're tailoring the facts to meet their conclusions. So there's always been a suspicion of this, but now we've got some proof coming out. But I think the thing that's important is that we learn to question things when they're coming from people we suspect of ulterior motives. We learn to question the science, ask specific questions about it, and come to our own conclusions. There are some other things we have to ask ourselves. If our planet is warming and the polar ice caps are shrinking, why are they shrinking on Mars? The polar ice caps are shrinking on Mars. Makes you think, you know, are the Martians polluting? Do they have a big coal industry that's driving up the CO2 and they're warming the planet of Mars? Or perhaps global warming, if we do have global warming, has something to do with solar cycles. You know, we've had geologic ages going on from time immemorial. In Greenland, the name Greenland tells you something, but they've now discovered graves recently where they have to dig through tundra and dig through ice and tundra a foot or two down, and they come upon graves that were dug with a shovel. So this means that Greenland was much warmer in recent history, maybe at the time of Leif Erikson and some of the exploration from Iceland into Greenland. So we have to question some of the conclusions before we decide that we're going to completely transform how we get energy in our country. You have to question it when the conclusions come from people like Al Gore, who tells us that we need to not be polluting, but he lives in a 24,000 square foot house and drives in a personal plane. He will pollute more in one trip to Europe on his private plane than my big Yukon XL will pollute in a lifetime. And yet he tells me I can't drive my big car. He wants to tell me I can't by limiting the options through regulations in Washington. with cap and trade would be a disaster for Kentucky, but it'd be a disaster for our country. 50% of the electricity, as most of you know, in our country is from coal. 90% of the electricity in Kentucky is from coal. It would be a disaster, though, even if we had no coal. It would be rising electric rates and taxes on your electric bill to everyone. We're in the middle of the greatest recession since the 1930s, and they want to increase taxes. Who are the taxes going to hurt the worst? Everybody pays electric bills, but if you're rich, you can absorb them a little more. The little guy's going to get hurt. The people that are on the way up, the people that are in the lower socioeconomic level, the working class, the elderly, those on fixed income, are going to be hurt worse by things like cap and trade. The question is it dead? You know, it got through the House, and I'll have to remind you there were 2 congressmen in Kentucky who voted for it, Yarmouth and Chandler. They happen to both be Democrats. There happens to be a president in the White House who's very anti-coal. And my understanding from being out here a couple times is it's not just cap and trade the coal industry is afraid of, it's slowing down the permit process. Obama is doing that through the EPA without any vote of Congress. He's doing it through executive order. They don't have coal, and so they're slowing down the executive process, the permit process. My position, which I think is a traditional Republican position, is that the more local the control, the more local the regulation, the better. And so it should be done here in town. Mountaintop removal should be a private property issue. But if there's an issue of pollution or an issue of needing a permit to mine, I think you should be deciding it at the county level even. If you have to decide it at the state level, so be it. But let's don't even have Washington involved at all in this. You have to understand how this all got started, though. This is not something new. If they ask you about health care, they ask Nancy Pelosi, where do you have the justification, the constitutional authority for health care? She looked like a deer in the headlights, like she'd never heard the Constitution. But she said, the Commerce Clause. Now, the Commerce Clause is what they've driven big government through for 60 years. And it started with a famous coal case. Carter v. Carter Coal Company. Is there still a Carter Coal Company around or not? This is in 1936. Up until 1936, the Supreme Court had uniformly struck down regulating mining through the Interstate Commerce Clause. Now, states regulated mining, but the federal government had no say in regulating mining until 1936. It all came about when FDR finally got enough people on the court. FDR eventually had 8 justices that he appointed, and they got enough people that agreed with his philosophy that they changed the Interstate Commerce Clause to mean about anything you can imagine. So every federal program that comes down the pike now is justified under the Interstate Commerce Clause. And that's where big government has grown. From 1937 to 1995, no federal law was struck down by the Supreme Court. This was a big change because routinely, in our entire history, all the way up until the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal, routinely the Supreme Court would strike down federal legislation that was overreaching, that allowed government to grow beyond its constitutional authority. Now, why is this important? It's important because it has to do with coal, it has to do with cap and trade, it has to do with health care, it has to do with every overreaching arm of government, is that we've overinterpreted and loosened the Commerce Clause to mean the federal government can get involved with anything. And it's part of our philosophy as Republicans, or at least my philosophy, that government should be local and limited. And if it would, the coal industry would thrive, but we would all thrive by getting government out of the way of business, out of the way of our lives. We would have smaller government, lower taxes. Government, though, is broken. It's broken at all levels, and it's gotten away from us. It is broken so much that I fear for the future of our country. I run for office not because it's easy. It was a 5-hour drive up here today and 5 hours back to Bowling Green.